About 5 years ago, Pastor Eric Mason came out with a book, and the book shocked the evangelical and Protestant world. It was called Woke Church. And for a while, it was all the rage and the hottest book that was coming off of the shelves in bookstores and, well, online bookstores these days. And over time, people began to realize that social justice, or wokeness as it was often called, other terms are racial reconciliation, ending racism. These things have new terms about every 5 minutes. Just these types of terms I'll use synonymously. These things are not what they seem. In other words, there is a label and then there's a substance. Label, anti racism. Substance, often complete racism, obvious racism. And so a lot of the moral depravity and evil that is wokeness that still permeates much of the church has been called out, and rightfully so. Exodus 20, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. Think about it. Social justice or wokeness, woke church ideas, often imported ideologies and ways of thinking and ways of treating one another from the outer culture and brought them into the church with a little bit of Jesus sprinkled on top. But social justice ideas, in terms of how people of different ethnicities were taught from pulpit to pew to treat one another, often were violating the ninth commandment. How were non-white Christians taught to treat white Christians and vice versa? Often, white Christians were almost guilty by association, or guilty, or at least under a larger moral code by virtue of their skin color. The ninth commandment was broken. Often, whole crowds of people that were white were called guilty, called to repentance for quote unquote racism simply for being white and existing. And those are the two criteria that you need to be these days in order to be racist in our culture. You're white and you exist, or you're white and you breathe. Not only is this fact true about the moral evil that is anti-racism, quote unquote, or social justice or wokeness, but there are also so many other foundational biblical principles and true common sense principles that this system of thinking and living and treating one another violates. God hates unequal weights and measures. Wokeness is foundationally unequal weights and measures. White people are treated at a completely different state than non-white people, and we are taught to view one another in those ways. And the people that are guilty of sinning in this way are not necessarily non-white people or white people. It's just anyone who embraces these ideas and treats others accordingly, shows partiality to someone who's not white, or treats someone who is white, even if they're also white, with a lesser degree of favor just because of skin color. That is evil. God hates unequal weights and measures. He hates partiality, and that is very basically prejudice. In short, wokeness is racism. We can all see that. Most of us that have an open Bible and are using our common sense see that. But that gets me to my point of this video. The moral evil, the utter sinfulness that is wokeness or social justice has been pointed out and exposed very well again and again and again. I can't say the same thing about 6 or 7 years ago in the larger culture, and I'm so thankful that so many faithful voices, voices like Vodi Bakum, voices like a guy like Tom Askell, come to mind of exposing this way of thinking. James White, you may have heard of him, Dr. James White of Apologia. These voices, John Harris, were so helpful in exposing the lies that is social justice, racial reconciliation. It's evil in the church, it's evil outside of the church because it's sin. But the most underrated factor, or maybe the least covered factor, that to me is so heinous and hurts so much about racial reconciliation, wokeness, is the following. That is, it is a complete insult to your intelligence. I'll say it again. Wokeness is an insult to your intelligence. I've already covered the fact that it's a breaking often of the ninth commandment, not bearing false witness, saying things about someone else by virtue of skin color that you have no idea of, showing something on a complete group when you don't really know the facts. Facts have gone out the window. But your intelligence in all of that, let's say the past 5 or 6 years, was insulted. The reason I say that is this. You were told, whether you're a believer, whether you're someone who might have just stumbled onto this channel and are not a believer, not a Christian, or maybe you're thinking about these things, you were told for years, and longer than just 5 years, but it ramped up 6, 7 years ago and got to a real height, 2020, 2021. You were told that there are consistent and obvious systemic issues that favor white people in our culture, and we are systemically racist against quote unquote people of color. By the way, notice the oppressor oppressed language here. Cultural Marxism. It's meant to divide, and it did. Wonderful job. Wonderful job from those who peddled it. But you were told these things. You were told that we have this massive problem in the current day. And why is this an insult to your intelligence? It's an insult to your intelligence because you were told to believe that about our society while not believing the things that were right in front of you. And what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is decades upon decades in growing measure of obvious anti-white sentiment in our culture, of the public acceptance and even promotion over time of being allowed and promoted to say things that are disparaging towards someone by virtue of their white skin. And also, every major institution that you can think of, whether it's a media company, whether it is a Christian institution, whether it's an academic institution, whether it's the military, whether it's a news broadcast, whatever it is, has for decades sinfully had policies and practices in place that promote and favor and have initiatives for the betterment of people whose skin is simply not white. And yet you and I are told that constantly there is this systemic problem, not of favoritism opposed to people with white skin, but things in the favor of those who have white skin. And so there's this massive obvious evidence right in front of you of things that we can actually see with receipts. And they're actually public policies, like on the books of all these companies with diversity initiatives. And yet you are told to judge by things that often we can't see or can't be proven. Is there racism from every last culture against one another? Pretty much, yes. Ultimately, racism is simply hatred stemming from the heart, and it can manifest in policies put in place by two or more people. And if you want to call that systemic, I'm okay with that. It just has to be an actual policy put in place by actual people, so we can actually put a sin on it and understand it and attack it. But what is often called that is not in existence, and what is in obvious existence is ignored. And you are gaslit. Here's another example of my intelligence, your intelligence, being insulted. Think about this. If you were part of a church, let's say 4 or 5 years ago, you probably sat through some sort of seminar or sermon or saw something online where someone who was in open and obvious rebellion against God in some way was platformed and then was put in place to lecture Christians on Christian ethics. I'll give you an example. I used to work for an organization, and I still love many people here, Campus Crusade for Christ, but I used to work for this organization that over time began to platform female, quote unquote, pastors. and there was no such thing as a female pastor. Eldership, which is what a pastor is, an elder, is reserved for males, qualified males. There is no example of a female elder in the New Testament, and there are plenty of examples of the qualifications of what is an elder. There is no such thing as female eldership. It's reserved for males, and so to call oneself and function as a pastor, as someone who is not a man, is open rebellion against God. And for someone who has been doing that and been called to repentance and refuses, that is continual, open rebellion against God, a lifestyle that is an open practice of sinfulness. And so I sat in crowds or saw videos of someone who was in open rebelliousness against God continually put on the stage and taught Christians on how to think about important cultural, ethical issues of the day. People who were not qualified, teaching those who at the very least were seeking to live a godly life. If you're a Christian, you're often hearing good sermons. I pray you are. You're often reading good books. You are often reading good books. I pray you are. I pray that you're hearing or reading the scriptures as well. So hopefully you are drinking from deep wells of truth about God and therefore instructed to how to live for Him. So think about if you're intaking these sorts of things: good books, the scriptures, solid sermons. You're spending time with your brothers and sisters of Christ. You're edifying one another. You're sharpening one another. You are drinking deeply from these awesome wells given by God. And you take your head up and you're ready to go out into the world. And then you are lectured by someone who says a statement to the effect of, hey, you know, Jesus, he wasn't white. And the social cues around you tell you that you're supposed to cheer, applaud, and pretend that that was profound or that anyone who's relevant believes anything differently. That is an insult to your intelligence, and it is a gaslighting tactic. You're being trained to think that you're crazy, or to think that what is right in front of you is not true. But you are not crazy. If you saw that as wrong, or if you smell something today that you think might be unbiblical, you might be onto something. Search the scriptures. Don't trust in your own conclusions, of course. Seek wise Christian counsel, but search the scriptures, much like the Bereans in Acts 17, to see if what is being spoken, taught, and you're told to live by is true. Do not accept evil from pulpit to pew, even if it sounds good. And the anti-racism, for a while, sounded good, but it was poison. It was fuel for racism, hatred, division, partiality, unequal weights and measures, and bearing false witness. It was an insult to your intelligence. But God will continue to sanctify you by the transforming and the renewing of your mind through His application of the scriptures by the power of the Spirit. I hope you found this helpful, and please, this time around, in the comments, let me know what you think about this. Did you find this to be true in your experience? Thank you so much. Hi, this is John with Wisdom for the Church. Please subscribe below, and I hope you enjoyed that video.